All right, folks, David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Go check out our website, nostalgiatrap.com. There's a lot of stuff on there, including all of the episodes we've ever done, plus links to our social media stuff, and most importantly, a link to our Patreon page where you can subscribe for $5 a month, access our entire library of bonus episodes, plus all sorts of other stuff. We've got a great regular column written by Justin Rogers Cooper called In the Trap, that's for subscribers only, where he goes into more detail, gives a lot of links and other ideas that expand and reflect on all of the stuff we talk about on these episodes. So go check that out. I appreciate everyone who subscribes to the show. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And enjoy this conversation. My guest today is Brian Oliu, and we're discussing his incredible book, Body Drop, Notes on Fandom and Pain in Professional Wrestling. Here is me and Brian Oliu. All right, Brian Oliu, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well, yeah.
I'm very excited to talk with you about your latest book, a book called, I want to say the name of it. I'm jealous of the name of it. I think academic titles are often, they're not as cool as this. Your book is called Body Drop, Notes on Fandom and Pain in Professional Wrestling. And that title caught my attention. So thanks so much for coming on to talk with me about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny for me, especially coming from my background as a creative writer. I had a different title, essentially a working title. And then in my talks with, University of North Carolina Press, they were like, we need to kind of change this a little bit more. And I was like, that's fine. And so it was some back and forth. So I fought pretty hard for the title, but I think it turned out really great. So
to me, I hear like Body Drop,
Yeah.
like I just hear that. I'm like, I'm ready to read this. And I want listeners to know that this book is written in a very particular style, which I really, really enjoyed. Very different from a lot of academic monographs I've read before. And I wanted to know a little bit, I guess this is the goal today, Brian, is I'd like to know a little bit about why wrestling, but also about why this style, because, you come from a background of creative writing. I know you're an English instructor, and like you're someone who's in that world. And I just really appreciated this sort of poetic take you had on a lot of this material. So maybe we can start there. Why this style?
Yeah. So for my background, like I said, is creative writing, and so I got really interested in the concept of the lyric essay. That was kind of the way that I started writing. When I was younger, like everyone, when they started off, I kind of wrote some bad poems, and so I wrote a lot of bad poems during like high school. I went to college. Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. That's it's a rite of passage, really. I could never write fiction. I was terrible at fiction. So I wrote some bad poems. And then I went to college at Loyola Maryland in Baltimore. And I got to work underneath a couple teachers, one Leah Purpura, another person, Jane Satterfield. And both of them were poets, but they were also essayists. And so they were writing kind of these essays that were like cool and poetic and kind of strange. And in those classes, I got introduced to a lot of, different essayists, whether it was, Albert Goldbarth or Joan Beard or, a bunch of different folks, Joan Didion, et cetera. And I thought to myself, like, oh, my idea of the essay was always kind of academic, but these people are doing something a little bit different, a little bit more poetically slanted. Specifically, a lyric essay, Leah Purpura wrote a lot of kind of about this lyric element where, the kind of goal is to educate the reader on kind of how one is feeling as well, and kind of having that element and kind of bringing out emotions when one reads. So that was something I was super interested in. And so that's kind of what I've been writing, or at least attempting to write here and there, in terms of my own personal style. I consider myself an essayist in that regard. People always say, oh, like poet, so on and so forth. I'm like, no, it's an essayist. And so I think it just comes from where I'm coming from, maybe a sense of pride, or I still want to represent like the people that I represented way back when. So yeah, that was kind of my mentality for it. And so a lot of stuff I started writing was very kind of esoteric. I liked kind of writing kind of riddles and puzzles and weird stuff and things that didn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, but you kind of link some stuff together. Definitely more on the kind of absurdist kind of poetry slant of things. And then I started to kind of write a little bit more about kind of a little bit more tangible. And so I started writing a little bit more straightforward essays. And then I tried my best to kind of merge the two, right? And to try to kind of have those things element. And so this book is kind of that element of merging the two, not just in terms of style, but also in kind of the way the narratives operate. When I originally wrote the book, so I would say like the book kind of has three different types of writing in it, and that kind of are interwoven. And so I would say that the first one I wrote was this kind of highly lyric things, which are about professional wrestlers that were kind of very poetic, very language heavy, very kind of visceral in how they were created. Those are the ones I wrote first. And so I kind of composed this thing. I made a bunch of things about these wrestlers, so on and so forth. And it was just kind of this collection. And then in my talkings with Lucas Church and folks at North Carolina, they're like, oh, this is good. We want like another narrative to kind of work their way through it. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And so that's when I started writing a little bit more of the straightforward essays that were kind of about the specific wrestling holds, right? So those were kind of based in reality. And so as a result of that, those essays had to be based a little bit more in reality. So that was kind of how I crafted those. And then they were like, this is great, we need one more. And so those were those smaller things, which in wrestling I like to call, I refer to them as spot calls, right? Which are those moments in wrestling where you see the wrestlers whisper to one another, right? And so kind of those moments where they get them close, you can hear them calling out, being like clothesline or, whip me in the corner or, reverse it, these types of things. And so those moments in the action in kind of this false world, these moments of reality kind of coming through. And so those are kind of the three narratives that I tried to kind of weave through, and the three styles I tried to weave through when creating this book.
That's great. It has sort of a appropriately meta kind of experience to read the book, which is playing with a lot of the ideas you're thinking about in terms of wrestling's fakeness and theatricality and those kinds of big questions. What it reminds me of? I don't know if you know this author, but it reminds me of a book that I've taught a couple times by DJ Waldy called Holy Land. I don't know if you've heard about that, but he writes about suburbs in LA. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, and it's very it reminded when I was reading your book, I was reminded of that book because it's like here's taking on a subject like wrestling or the suburbs that you could do a lot of different ways, and academics have done a lot of different ways. But bringing this different style to it, to me, like brought out something really really important and thematically appropriate for the material, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of my mentality for it too. I think it just kind of lined itself up perfectly. I'd written a lot about, again, kind of that more highly lyric stuff and kind of how I create things, especially with my other books. And so, but this was kind of like the perfect storm of it all kind of coming together, right? And kind of having all those kind of different types of, again, those highly lyric elements kind of be utilized, and I could be like, oh, well, this makes sense because this kind of highly floral language is kind of this presentation, right? And that's what this high glossness to it, and that's what we love about professional wrestling. We love the gaudiness, we love kind of the pageantry of it. And so I was like, well, yeah, these pieces, therefore, how they're written, they have to be kind of gaudy in a certain way, or kind of have a lot of flourishes to them. And so it kind of was this kind of natural fit that occurred.
It's kind of crazy to live in, and I've been feeling this. I mean, I was in graduate school years ago, but it was already building from a lot of people in English, a lot of people in American studies, and a lot of people in theater studies who were writing about wrestling and thinking about wrestling. And it's kind of been bizarre because wrestling has become, it's like the Trump world matches wrestling, right? In some way, right? It seems, and there's been a lot written about that. Your book gets into different sort of narratives, though, in terms of what wrestling is. I mean, we got the kayfabe idea, and we can talk about that. But I'd like to just, start in general. Why wrestling for you personally? Like, was there a moment when because I certainly experienced this moment in graduate school where I thought, because I realized what I was going to write about, and I thought, oh, that's perfect, because it like combines so many different things I've been thinking about for so many years. How much has wrestling, I guess, been a part of your life? And was there a moment like that where you're like, yes, I must write about wrestling?
Yeah, so wrestling has been a part of my life for a very long time. So I've always been someone who loves professional wrestling, growing up with it. And so it was something that I loved as a kid, and I would just watch constantly. I loved kind of just I'd go over to a friend's house. Again, I joke like in terms of like, those origin stories, right? They have those moments where like I think Patton Oswalt has a great skit where he talks about like, oh, when he's watching a documentary about the Beatles and Paul McCartney walks past like a guitar when he's 7 years old and you're like, oh, this is the moment. Right. So my mom worked at a library, and so I'd spend all the time at the library after school. And then certain days, like I'd be like the neighbor across the street to go over there, and they watch wrestling and they had the tapes, right? So you'd like watch these like recorded, and they were from forever ago. They were like SummerSlam 1980, whatever. And so I'd watch them, and I'd get really into them. And so then I'd go back to the library and like read, right? So this was kind of these moments that happened. But it was just something I really enjoyed. I just thought it was like wild and fun, and the just kind of the personal elements of things. And I just loved how I'm thinking even as what I loved as a kid, right? Is it just seemed so over the top, but the narratives are so easy to figure out, and the characters were wild, and I just loved the characters. And I loved, you mentioned kind of the world that we live in. I love a soliloquy, right? Like that's kind of how wrestling works. These promos, these direct addresses to both another wrestler, but also the world at large, and also to your television audience. And so those were some things I really found myself drawn to. And so I continue to watch. I was one of those kids that like never grew out of it. Those kind of doldrum days where, you know, even in middle school, people didn't really watch wrestling, but then Attitude Era was huge when I was in high school. And so it had this massive resurgence with Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and
That's right.
Mankind.
Yeah.
The Undertaker was always around, but like this massive resurgence. So I was in the know. And I was like, oh yeah, like I know all these things are going on. And so like I could almost like predict, I became kind of a soothsayer because I could predict what was going to happen tonight. Right. And I was like, oh, I bet you this is going to happen. And so I got like really into those things. And so
That's
that
such a
continued.
funny idea that you would become like a guru, like all of a sudden, like something that is not cool, but you're into it, and then it becomes cool, and you're the guy that's like, That's like it's like the accidental hipster, the
It
person
really
who's like, I was
is.
into it before it was cool. Yeah.
It really is. Like, yeah, I just kind of saw the cycles through. I made a I joke about this. I had a similar thing happen with like yo-yos. Like yo-yos got really in like fifth grade. And then they weren't
I remember this.
and then they weren't cool. But then they like came back in like 2 years. But in that meantime, I had like gotten really, I never got the memo. So then I came back when I was like in eighth grade, where you're like, your social capital needs to be the highest it needs to be. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can do this trick. I do that trick. I'm terrible at yo-yos now. But yeah, so that was kind of a similar thing where it kind of came back in, and then I just kind of followed along, and then become kind of what they, the smart mark, right? You start knowing kind of everything there is to know about wrestling. You start like reading the stuff on the internet, you start kind of merging these worlds together. And so I just kind of followed along, and I continue to follow along. And, even, you kind of ebb and flow a little bit. Certainly have some gaps in my wrestling fandom history. And also wrestling is massive, right? Like it's not just American style, WWE, AEW, you can talk about Japanese pro wrestling, you can go all over the place, all these independent wrestling stuff too. Which I was like kind of into cursory elements too, but I was always interested, especially I think, and I hope the book displays this, is I was always interested in the television. I love TV.
Mm-hmm.
And so like for me, it was always about the television show. So like people would go, oh, we're going to this independent wrestling show. And I'd be like, I'd go, but it wasn't my thing. I liked the pageant. I loved kind of like the picture in picture promos. I loved the whole fact that this is a television show.
I don't think a lot. I don't think a lot of people even know that there's this whole world like of independent wrestling. I mean, it's insane. I mean, to me, I'm thinking of like, the Wrestler movie with Mickey Rourke.
Yes.
As like depicting that world in a really like intense, like traumatic way. But also, it makes me think of you're bringing all these memories up of like the '90s and 2000s, that era of like. Backyard wrestling was like a thing for a while.
Yes.
If you remember, I feel like even before the internet, before YouTube, like people were doing that sort of stuff, and that led to like Jackass.
Yes.
And I'm like now I'm like, wait, is Jackass a part of the professional wrestling world, or is it something like, because I think Johnny Knoxville's come and been a part
he
of that
just
world. Yeah.
he just wrestled at WrestleMania, yeah, and it was great in this like massive prop match. It was fun. It was very good.
That's
But
yeah.
they're very much adjacent to each other. And I think even you mentioned Jackass. Well, Jackass was like skateboard culture too, right? And
That's
so I think
right.
it was
Yeah.
all that kind of element working together where it was DIY kids just like goofing off, and even the kind of that punk rock subculture, or all of those elements where I mean, as a kid, when I was in high school, like we were in like punk bands or whatever, and they were terrible, like they were whatever. That was more about the pageantry, but there was always the kid with the video camera, right? He was the guy who just like, oh, you always got to make sure that Sam has his video camera, and Sam had his video camera. You just like tape all the dumb stuff that we did. And so I think that was kind of out of that, and like you never knew there's much of an audience behind it, but especially with the blowing up of the internet, the fact that you could like trade tapes, right? I mean, that was mostly how you got. So again, I think I mentioned I grew up in New Jersey. Across the river, there's a flea market called Rice's Market in Pennsylvania, and there was a guy who like traded ECW tapes and New Japan Pro Wrestling tapes and All Japan Pro Wrestling tapes. And so as a kid, I would go there, and all my friends would buy fireworks, and I would go get professional wrestling
See,
tapes.
I love that illicit things, like going and getting pornography.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
when I was young, I mean, this makes me feel like the old timer that's like, you kids don't know what this is like. But like,
Right.
it was hard to find illicit material. It was definitely harder than it is now. And like, I remember, friends, this was the beginnings of like MMA and like,
Yes.
what they called ultimate fighting back then.
Yeah, K1 and all that
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and like my brothers were older, and they came home, sometimes with these videotapes, and like we'd have to wait till my parents were gone to watch these guys beat the shit out of each other on these videotapes, and it felt like something. I wonder, like, I guess this is the academic question for you. It's like, sort of, is wrestling, is it underground culture? Because it's sort of, it's weird because it's so in the mainstream, like we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does have this sort of like, it's still edgy to me. It still feels that way.
I think so too. Especially kind of presented as kind of, I mean, there's always wrestling. Wrestling's always trying to prevent themselves. Like we have WWE, which of course is the massive kind of global corporation. And, there's a big to do about when WWE went kind of TV PG,
this
right?
Is the Vince McMahon Corporation, right?
Vince McMahon Corporation. It is a corporation. It is a conglomerate, very much so. But there's always been the search for the WWE alternative, right? And so like this was always kind of Rage Against the Machine, right? Like instead of the big evil that has like a television deal, we're going to be ECW, right? Where we're just going to like
we're the real wrestlers.
We're the real wrestlers, where there's blood and barbed wire matches and like anything else that happens, right? The counterculture always becomes mainstream, right? It always becomes adapted, and that's kind of how it works, right? Like, and then WWE started doing hardcore matches and taking these wrestlers in, and even now, right now, like there's a huge push for independent wrestling. Well, then WWE went and gobbled up all the independent wrestlers, right? And so they became kind of more in this kind of element, and now we have AEW, which kind of has that independent feel to it, but it still has Ted Turner money behind it, right? It's like it's the same thing. This is a conversation that I always have with my wife a whole bunch, where again, I put myself, I'm going to be 40 this year. And I'm kind of right in that. We were joking before about kind of millennial and Gen X divide, right? Where we had those moments where, the boy bands would win every week on TRL, right? And they'd win every week. And then all of a sudden, like Limp Bizkit would get to like Nookie would get to number one. Right. And we were like, we did it. We took down the machine. Well, no, you didn't. Right.
Yes,
of course you didn't. Like, that counterculture was mainstream. Right. Like that was kind of how it was. Like, yeah, of course. Like they're still making money off of this thing. They're
even
still
that looks like wrestling in my mind, like NSYNC versus Limp Bizkit, And it's like, do you want the like the soft boy band or the mean rock band, And it's like, aren't they all the same company though?
Exactly. They're all under the same thing. I think they're all under what are Interscope, right? And they're like, oh my God, like, wait a second. And then you're like, wait a second. Well, that means like punk rock's the true thing. It's like, well, no, it's not. Like at the same time, like, there even that kind of element to it, there's still kind of those things. This is how we push people, right? This is how we all just wanted to kind of fall within an archetype anyway, right? And so I think like, those elements are like, oh yeah, I listen to the true stuff. And it's like, yeah, well, it still kind of falls underneath these kind of elements to them. And so I think that a lot about that when it comes to professional wrestling, is that, it's still kind of the same element. So for me, like, yeah, we joke, I mean, WWE wants I focus the book a lot on kind of WWE, WWF, just because again it's massive, and so I don't want to kind of get too inside baseball of stuff, right? So, I do touch upon, because I do love Japanese pro wrestling and kind of how that created, and coming from MMA and all these kind of official things. You always look up people and you're like, oh, this professional wrestler is really great. Oh, they went like 7-2 in like professional MMA careers, right? And so you're like, oh, this guy's legit. And so I kind of come back to kind of all that stuff where WD wants to be mainstream more than anything else, right? They want to be like the Super Bowl. They hate the NFL because Monday Night Football is on the same time Monday Night Raw is, and so they're trying to like fight for the same audience, but they try to get more mainstream as possible, which is why we get like Johnny Knoxville, which is why like Logan Paul wrestled at WrestleMania. They bring in Aretha Franklin sang at an early WrestleMania, like. Yeah, like we mentioned Limp Bizkit, Fred Durst wrestled, and all these people trying to tap into this.
What is the perceived barrier? Because I feel like part of it is like a class thing. Like it's sort of like this idea that like wrestling is kind of trashy, and like how could it be elevated to something that would be in the pantheon of great athletes like the NFL or baseball or something like that. It feels like the resistance from. I mean, I don't know what the resistance is, but do you know what I'm talking about? It feels like it doesn't. Like it almost feels like the liberal sort of elite, whatever that is, would be disgusted in the same way that they're disgusted at like the way Trump has all the McDonald's laid out in the White House.
Right. Yeah.
Like if wrestling is like elevated to this pantheon of mainstream sports, then that would be a comment on how we've gone down the toilet in America in some way.
Of course, yeah. And we hear that all the time too. We joke about liberal elite, but like at the same time, like wrestling is very leftist. It's very there's a lot. It has a massive LGBTQ fan base, trans fan base. Like it's huge. Like and
so ironic, isn't it?
It's wild, yeah. And like half the obviously I'm on Twitter, and half the folks I follow, who love professional wrestling, there's podcasts who are trans, and they talk about these things. And it's just like, it's like, no, you don't understand. Like people are like, oh, this is meant to be for X, Y, Z. It's like, yeah, but you've also kind of cultivated this other group of people, that love it. Even I had a conversation.
Unintentionally cultivated, it seems.
Unintentionally.
Right?
And I think like for me, like I think back to, this was, I was confessing I'm a professional wrestling fan, right? This is like 2000. This is when I became a grad student. And then I was talking with someone who was a tenure track professor at UA. And he was like, oh, I love professional wrestling. And I would be like someone I never really expected. And they were like, yeah, like I was a gay kid growing up. It was my only excuse where I could watch like shirtless, attractive men wrestle with one another. And I fell in love with it. And I loved the pageantry, and I loved the outfits, and I loved the divas, and I loved all these things. When you put it that way,
it feels very natural. It feels very gay. Like, you know, and looking at it like, yeah, it's theater, it's camp, It's camp. And there's layers of satire at play here. And
absolutely.
Oiled up, beautiful male bodies. Who could not see that? Yeah.
Right. And I think like that's what I think people miss, right? They maybe kind of see, oh, the trashiness, or they kind of witness the, whatever. Or they kind of think back to what professional wrestling, and I talk about this a lot, where they think back to what professional wrestling was, even during that turn of the century, where it was kind of at the height, or turn of the millennium height, where 2000s, where it was that kind of attitude era, ECW influence, where people were beating the heck out of each other, and there were barbed wire matches and all that, and like nudity and all that stuff, like faux nudity, simulated nudity, and they think, oh, that was the kind of that trashy Jerry Springer inspired stuff, right? And so wrestlers back then, a lot of times they were folks that were like interested, they were bodybuilders, right? They're sometimes former professional athletes, who didn't really care about wrestling, right? They're like, oh, this is a way to get some money, this is kind of my way to quote unquote get over. And so they kind of got into wrestling. Now, those are the people that were professional wrestlers. Now, most professional wrestlers are the dorks that grew up on that, right? Like, so there's all these great, there's all these great photos of like today's superstars, like posing with like Jeff Hardy, or like posing with CM Punk when they were like 9 years old, and kind of see that, and you're like, oh, I grew up watching professional wrestling and I wanted to become a professional wrestler. And so they're like these nerdy kids who grew up loving the sport. And so as a result of that, I think it's a little it's slightly more wholesome, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's a little bit
Interesting.
more,
Yeah.
it's more endearing, and you can kind of see folks that kind of grew up on it, as opposed to Hulk Hogan, who was just like out there for a paycheck, right? And to be fair to Hulk Hogan, he did like actually like go to Japan and try to get better. But
He became like a real life villain.
oh yeah, 100%. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It was funny. I was watching some documentary the other day, and my wife came in, but we have a newborn, and so she comes in to like take care of the kid, and like 11 o'clock, and they're talking about it was a thing talking about Hulk Hogan being a villain, and they made some quip, and she was like, "Oh, I thought they were going to talk about Gawker," and they're like, "No, they would not bring up Gawker in this very glowing, thing that I was talking about Hulk Hogan." But yeah, so I think like that kind of comes back to me is these elements of the kids that grew up on professional wrestling and becoming professional wrestlers, and even just ourselves, like as myself, as someone who grew up on professional wrestling in that time, and kind of finding my way into it, or journalists that find their way into it. I think it's really fascinating. I think it does. Obviously, you have quote unquote liberal elite, but there's a lot of the fans are, I forget, it's a very diverse fan base.
Yeah, right.
Not just when we talked about LGBTQ, but also Hispanic, right? And Black,
right,
and
right.
all and Japanese, right? So all these things, it's a very diverse fan base.
I think the Mexican wrestling world is like this massive piece of culture as well. And I mean,
absolutely.
I'm from Southern California, so it's like it's present here as well,
absolutely,
in like really, really visible ways. And like young people, like really little kids, love to wear those masks, and like it's sort of, I mean, it's kind of connected in the same way I think for little kids to like Marvel and things like that in a weird way.
Absolutely,
like, it's fantasy. It's sort of like a one more thing to like dress up and act things out, if that makes sense. And it seems
perfect.
Funny to think adults are really still into that too,
Of course, right. Like, I mean, that's always the conversation that happens. It's funny you mentioned Marvel, right? Like Rey Mysterio, right? He's probably the most famous, at least mainstream luchador. For his big matches, he comes out in like comic book themed masks and gear, right? So
that makes sense.
Famously came out with like a Riddler one that was all green. But I think it's part of that too, where we have folks like who are super into Marvel movies and superhero stuff, and they're like, oh, that's allowed to be mainstream, but wrestling isn't necessarily allowed to be mainstream.
Mainstream in like a different way. Occupies. I wonder
a different space. Yeah.
I wonder what we can say. I mean, I think there's a million things to say, but what we can give people that is in your book and is a part of this discussion is like ideas about masculinity and sort of like what the male body is and what men are, because I'm very ambivalent about a lot of that stuff. Like I'm sort of like engaged in a lot of different ways. Like I think I can respond to that stuff because in part, in terms of our generational position, we grew up in the 80s during this moment where like giant male bodies were everywhere. Like it was just like Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
I mean, Sylvester Stallone in the 80s was insanely huge. Like these movies were just that Rambo just got bigger and bigger in every sequel. And like, what is that about? And I feel like we're in a moment with that now with the like all the like Chris Pratt and like all these different like dudes are trying to get like as yoked as possible. And it's interesting to me. It's something that I go to the gym and I like that whole culture. At the same time, I'm kind of always like, because I'm an academic, I guess I'm just like, what the fuck does all of this mean? What are we doing?
I know. Yeah. Hard same. So, it's funny you mentioned that. Like I have my other book's on Rocky, and I wrote a book, a collaborative
there you go.
book of poems about Rocky and the film series. So I'm very, very invested in Rocky and Sylvester Stallone, and take his shirt coming off in Rocky 4, after he's been training in the mountains.
Yeah.
And so
to fight the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Absolutely. And so, I think like, especially that, I mean, it's, we talk about these things, but like, I joke about Alabama, there's a Bear Bryant line, same thing, that wins always won. Right. And so like, that's kind of this line I think about, it's like, oh yeah, back then it's like, oh, to be this, to be huge. My wife and I were talking about this too. And it's less so men. Sometimes it's men have always been kind of in this thing where it's like, oh, we have to be muscular, to be muscular to be masculine, right? And so, but my wife was noticing in terms of especially Instagram stuff is we have these before and after things where they're like, here's a picture of a girl from 2009 who's very skinny, right? And then there's a picture of them now, and they've like started lifting weights, and they're like, I was healthy in 2009, but now I know what true health is, and that's not necessarily true, right? Our body types and the way we've idealized our platonic, woman body has shifted, right? Like, it's not cool to be skinny anymore. It's not cool to be Paris Hilton anymore. You want to be like have muscle tone, right? And so like, we haven't necessarily become healthier in the same way like wrestling too, or like male bodies, right? It's like, oh, it's not necessarily cool to be like super jacked anymore, but you still want to be like lean. You want to have a CrossFit body as opposed to a bodybuilder body, right? And we can claim it as healthy.
Is enough to drive you crazy.
Oh, it'll drive you bonkers, man.
I'm thinking about like these like Instagram like little ads that I see that are like all these different drawings of male bodies,
Yeah.
And like,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and they're like, this is and they name them, this is the urban lumberjack body, and this is
right.
And I'm kind of looking at them, and it's hard not to compare your own body to this. That like, which one am I? Which one should I be? Which one is the one that would be my best self that people would appreciate them? I mean, it's really deep in like how it's sort of hitting insecurity and
it's also like it's myth making too, like you said, urban lumberjack. Who wouldn't want to be an urban lumberjack? That sounds dope as hell, right? But it is, it's like, oh, do this exercise to be like, oh, if you this type of thing, like do that, right? Or like this is you are what mesomorph, I don't remember the names, but like you're this type of body type. Well, if you're this is your genetics, here's your ideal, and here's what you have to do to become your like fully realized body. And you're like, man, that's bullshit. Like that sucks. Like all that stuff sucks. And so I think like men have always been kind of concerned about their bodies for sure. And obviously watching wrestling and kind of growing up in that and thinking about like watching these ideals and all these elements. And you have wrestlers who even to this day, right, you have these independent wrestlers who show up and they don't get like kind of mainstream until they lose 30 pounds, right? Until they get the like 6-pack abs, right? You have these independent skinny kids who can wrestle their ass off, but they don't look good on television because they don't fit that kind of mold. And so I think for me, like I said, I'm susceptible to it too. Like I'm somebody who has, I'm a runner, right? So I do long distance running, but I'm also like 300 pounds, right? So, kind of dealing with those type of elements and kind of balancing those things and, even having those moments of myself. And I write about running in the book, I think a little bit just because it was just so attached to where I was at that time, right? I was in a lot of pain when I was writing the book itself because I had like a couple at least from running, I was a little beat up from that. Finishing a marathon. And so I was kind of going back to these things, my own kind of personal health elements. And so, but it's interesting kind of seeing the running and having folks do that same thing. It was like, oh, to have a runner's body, you need to do X, Y, and Z. But at the same time, we also have the counter element where my wife and I were joking about life coaches, right? Where you have this element of being like, intuitive eating, like you should be intuitive, this will work. I'm like, well, if I was an intuitive eater, I would just eat donuts the entire day. Like if I listened to what my body wanted, like this is what I would get. I don't like, so that does not work for me.
That's what sucks about like getting older, honestly, and this is different, I think at different ages for different people, but like the donut thing for sure for me is like realizing that I had to like intervene in sort of what I eat and what I do. Because I am a sugar person and it's not good. And it's not good for me. And I've gotten to the point where doctors are, in your 40s are like, now it's time to kind of pay attention to these sorts of things. You can develop diabetes really quickly in your 40s and 50s, And so it's, it's now for the first time I'm thinking about what I should eat in a different way. And I don't know. I'm tying this to masculinity and bodies, and I'm thinking about wrestling and bodies, and like, the look of the body is obviously really important. Like how big, how muscular, etc. How much oil is applied, etc. But it also makes me think about like the masculinity coming from how much courage there is in facing punishment, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Sort of like,
absolutely.
because I grew up in a neighborhood, like a very typical like Stranger Things neighborhood, with a bunch of boys riding bikes around,
Yeah,
finding stuff in big like parking lots and dumpsters, and building
yeah,
skateboard ramps. And there was a sense that like we were daring each other to do ever more dangerous things, and like,
right, absolutely.
and it feels like wrestling sort of encapsulates that really. And I mean, Jackass is sort of doing that as well.
Yeah,
Like how much pain, and that, to me, that like watching The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke was the first time I had thought about, and now I know people are writing about it a lot, like how fucked up people get from doing this shit. I mean, it's insane to say this is fake when you're kind of like, hold on, like the pain that these guys deal with for the rest of their lives is on the level of like, the shit that like people in the NFL deal with for the rest of their
yeah.
lives. It's
No, you're exactly right. And I
it's
think like,
yeah, punishment, I guess.
right. And
Yeah.
even, I think it's easy for us to take a look at, say, someone like Mick Foley, Mankind, Cactus Jack, who did those like essentially death matches and were getting thrown off cages and things like that, and be like, oh, that guy's crazy. Like that guy has been thrown off cages, blah, 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 blah. Wrestlers, we don't do that anymore. It's like, well, still, like wrestlers are still beating themselves up and taking like flat backs, which is like no easy task, right? Like every single thing they do is kind of
And
jarring,
they're
right? It's a
not
lot of
wearing
impact.
like it would be weird if they wore
No,
like a whole bunch of helmets and stuff.
no, yeah.
It's weird because I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm thinking about another masculine sport is rodeos. I grew up going to a lot of
Oh,
rodeos
interesting.
when I was young. And at some point people were getting really hurt on these rodeos because they're like they're doing fucking dangerous shit with these big animals, and some people were
Yeah,
getting killed, broken necks, etc. And at some point there was like a push to like wear like neck braces, and you saw these guys, and those guys got made fun of
of
for
course they
you
did.
know what I mean? And I'm thinking
Yeah.
about that with regards to wrestling too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Where I mean, that kind of push towards masculinity, and there's always going to be you're always going to be judged by by the generation before you for not being as tough as the generation. Like this is a tale as old as time, right? Like, so I teach
Break that neck.
yeah, I teach American literature sometimes at UA, and so one of the things I talk about, we teach. I'll teach like Jack London, right? And so, going in and talking about like the Klondike gold rush, right? And like that was like essentially one of the arguments for that is like the generation before got the Klondike gold rush and essentially just said, oh, this new generation's soft, right? Like they didn't get to do they didn't do the Klondike rush. Like, so the opportunity presented itself to go do, advanced level gold rush in the frozen tundra, and like that was people seized that, right? And so this constant thing of like, oh, this next generation soft. So like as a result, we do more and more wild stuff, right? Like it kind of accentuates itself. So
Yeah.
it's like kind of
Right.
searching, because you hear that all the time, and it's all bullshit. It's all pseudoscience nonsense, right? Where people are like, well, this generation's less tough than the previous generation. It's like, well, we've been saying that forever. Like, it's been, every generation's softer than the last. It's like, no, it just presents itself in a different way. It's just people changing their concepts of masculinity in the same way we change our concepts of what the ideal body type was, right? And so, I think like as a result of that, it's just, you hear these again, like whoever, these people have treatises on masculinity talking about like, oh, this is what our ancestors would have wanted. And you're like, no, like absolutely not. Like,
Well,
as
you
yeah,
hear.
I
I
was
mean,
like, yeah.
I'm hearing Joe Rogan when you're saying this. And I
Right.
feel
Yeah.
like
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that's saying without saying. Jordan Peterson, all those assholes. Um, I think what's interesting. So I think I mentioned I was a runner, and I mentioned running in the book.
Mhm.
There's a book called Born to Run, which is like a famous kind of book, which kind of talking about the Tamahara tribe in Mexico, who are like these epitome of these long distance runners. And there's like a culture of running, and they'd run these like incredible distances. And so at some point, someone wanted to kind of monetize them and bring them into the United States to have them run these races, so on and so forth. And so they'd go down there, and they realized that all these folks were like running barefoot, right? And so the book itself kind of spurned the barefoot running movement,
I
or
remember
like,
this. I think was this in our
and
lifetime? Yeah.
yes, oh yeah, no, this would have been like the mid 2000s.
Right.
So like even like the toe shoes,
Oh
and like the
God,
minimal shoes and things like
the
that.
worst.
And so they were talking about these things, and it was because they went and saw like, oh yes, this is X, Y, and Z. Um, and then they re-released it. They released a documentary on one of the 30 for 30 ESPN things. I forget the name of it, but they go back down there to kind of talk about the impact the book had, because the book was like this massive thing, and now all these people wanted to go run this race in the middle of Mexico, right? And so it turned into like this massive kind of tourist adventure destination. And they're talking to one of the original guys, and he's watching someone, and he's talking about like, oh, running barefoot, and then the guy's like, well, why? The guy who's like spurred the barefoot running saw somebody running barefoot, and he's like, why is he running barefoot? And they're like, oh, because you did it. And he's like, oh, like, wow, that's stupid. I wish I had my feet hurt, right? I wish I had the money to like wear the shoes, right?
That's
And so
amazing. Yeah.
I think there's always kind of that moment, and I that kind of thing of wanting to like, oh yes, our ancestors had it best, or things like that, which is not
Right.
true.
Right.
You see that, I mean, we hear of that. We talk about diet stuff like, oh, it's cool to eat paleo, and you're like, what does that mean? Like, what does that even mean? Like, I don't know
Oh
what
yeah.
paleo is.
I
Like,
mean, hey, this kind of thinking leads right into anti-vax and all that kind of stuff.
absolutely.
Honestly,
Oh,
right?
100%. It's all connected. It's all connected to that stuff. And so, yeah, I think that kind of strive for masculinity, or strive for, I mean, it's all kind of a return to once. It's like, again, that ancestor element to it. We compare professional wrestlers' bodies to like Greek gods or statues, right? It's still kind of chasing this like this old ideal, right? And it's so this masculinity is still kind of, it's grounded in caveman culture, but like it's,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's
and
bizarre.
women involved in it as well, like
Yes,
like
100%.
women expressing that same sort of thing. I wonder if we can talk about just fighting. I mean,
Yeah,
we only have a little bit of time left, but
yeah,
I love to talk about like fighting as a sort, because
yeah,
I think about that with Joe Rogan too. It's sort of like that's when that's when you find out when who's a men are men, and that's who you find out
yeah,
who you really are, is when you're grappling with somebody else. And like part of me like rolls my eyes when I hear that shit, and the other part of me is
yeah.
like, man, I've been in like, sort of like physical altercations with people, even just remembering wrestling with my brothers growing up, which was an intense experience. And
Yeah,
like being raised
yeah,
with
yeah.
three boys in my family. We were all similar ages, and I was the youngest, and so I had to fight very viciously,
Of
against my
course, yeah,
brothers. And I can identify with the sort of like all the hatred and passion and beauty of of that sort of thing. But I wonder
yeah,
what your thoughts are on just sort of fighting as a part of this, because it seems like, I don't
yeah,
know. I have an ambivalent attitude towards it, because I'm like, ooh, part of me is like, ooh, it's violence. We shouldn't. Why are we enacting violence? And the other part of me is like,
yeah.
we need this.
I know. I think like, again, kind of that element too. I think about that a lot as well, where it's just like, sometimes people just need to get hit, right? Like it's kind of
Oh
that moment
God,
of
yeah.
thinking back to that, or there's the famous kind of Mike Tyson quote, which I quote, where he says like, everyone's got a plan till they get hit in the face, right? Like, and so I think there's something to that as well. But at the same time, like I think like we talk about, oh, this guy just wanted it more, or this guy just like dug deep and like really did these things. Like, but at the same time, like, I think I think we fall into that trap as well, because I could want something more than anything else in terms of like playing basketball, right? Or I could do something like that, but I'd still get my ass kicked. Like I'd still, I still wouldn't have the ability to do that. But I think like fighting gets a pass, like I think
Mm.
fighting requires, like, people are skilled. People are like very skilled fighters, and have practiced this stuff, and have trained and have done these things. And for me to like go in because like my I want it more, like I'm gonna get my nose broken, like I think like
Movies
that
like
kind of,
Rocky really put that in people's mind, though. That idea of like,
yes,
it's the guy who has more passion
yes,
that is the guy who triumphs, and it's like, no, it's probably the guy that is better at kicking ass that's going to
yeah,
triumph. Yeah.
exactly. And we love that triumph of the underdog, right? And I think that's kind of the fun thing about watching professional wrestling, is you do have like, there was always this kind of, we mentioned like Rey Mysterio, right? And like Rey Mysterio was kind of this guy, and you'd see him like, he's this tiny little diminutive guy, like, he's his punching power is not going to be enough to knock down Goldberg, right? Like it's not going to be able, he's not going to be able to do that. But we love those roles, right? Like there's no way that this person could be able to take down this other person, which is why, we see someone like Brock Lesnar, who's this perfect fighter, but he has diverticulitis, right? And so like this element of like, he always has to have this weakness, or they always kind of play up the fact like, oh, his back, oh, he injured his back.
It really is like a Marvel movie.
It is,
or there's like a narrative property to it. Yeah,
always. And they're like, oh, we have to demonstrate that this guy who has no weaknesses has a weakness. But that's not always the truth. Like that's not how it works. Like that's still a part of the narrative, right? Like if I'm somebody who's not a trained fighter and someone goes up to me and I'm fighting a UFC guy and they're like, oh, well, his left side is open, I don't know how to take advantage of that, right? He's still gonna, like, who cares? He's still at like this level, he's still a 99 and I'm still like a 45, right? Like I'm still gonna get worked. But I think like, but we like to imagine that we could, right? We always like to imagine. I think that's what wrestling does too. It allows us to be like, oh, we love the everyman. We love Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's the everyman. Who doesn't want to beat up their boss, right? Like he is,
and
like,
crack 2 beer cans open on your head while you're doing
man.
it. Yeah,
and he just looks like an angry dad with his two knee braces and his t-shirt and his beer. Like we're like, that's my guy.
There's a sense of, you say that, and I'm remembering that, and I'm like, there was a sense of underdog justice to that was definitely like class.
100%.
Sort of like getting one over and just being like, this guy is the quote unquote like real American. It could be weaponized in lots of different ways and very reactionary
100%,
ways, but it's also like it doesn't have to be that, right?
It doesn't have to be that. And I think folks that like, recognize that, or sometimes they do recognize in the storytelling, they're like, yeah, this is kind of an underdog kind of story. I mean, they love telling that story, and some they do it to varying degrees sometimes. One of the things I thought was really interesting is Kofi Kingston, or the Kofi Mania, right? Kind of one of the first Black WWE champions. This was a couple years ago, where that became part of the story, is that WWE doesn't have Black champions that often. And so that became kind of a thing, like the man was holding him down, and Vince McMahon, the ultimate villain, comes in and like he earns a WrestleMania title shot, and Vince McMahon is like, no, we're going to put more things, like obstacles in front of you. Like this Black man who had earned this thing.
Yeah.
He says, oh, you actually didn't earn this thing.
That whole thing is such a mind fuck to think about Vince McMahon.
Really?
Because I'm like, is he a character? You know what I mean? Like he seems like he's a character of like this megalomaniacal, corporate owner.
Yeah.
At the same time, it seems like that character fits so perfectly with like what he's building that it seems very constructed, if that makes sense.
It is. And I mean, that was kind of a big moment where
where's the real Vince?
Right. And he was like a commentator, right? So we didn't know that he was kind of in on it. Like he was kind of the main guy, because he just did commentary. But there was the famous moment where Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels was kind of the Montreal screw job, right? Where they wanted to get the belt off of Bret Hart. They changed the actual, he was leaving the company. They changed the actual ending of the match. The original ending of the match was Bret was supposed to win and then give up the title. Instead, they changed the match, did a quick count, and had Shawn Michaels beat him. And Bret Hart like spit in Vince McMahon's face and all these things. And then they took that and were like, yes, no, Vince McMahon is evil. And he's the man behind pulling the puppets. And so that was the birth of this character.
That's so brilliant. There's something brilliant about all of it.
It's brilliant. A lot of it is absolutely brilliant. Knowing
it
exactly
reminds
kind of
me of Trump, honestly, in that sense of like where you're sitting, like it has this quality of like, is this real or is it not? And it feels like that quality, that question that it generates in me, is part of the engine of the power, if that makes sense.
Always. And I love, as someone who we mentioned internet culture and becoming a wrestling fan, but like internet trolling, right? It's all trolling. I mean, that's kind of what it is, where it's this thing where, and to be a troll, right? To be an effective troll, you can't believe in what you're doing, but you have to believe in it a little bit, right? Like you can't actually believe it, but like in the same way that if you,
I love that. That is so well put. Like you can't believe in it, but you have to a little bit.
A little bit, right? And that was what Trump did, is like he would say these ridiculous things. I don't know how much he believed it back, especially when he started, but then he had an army of people who believed everything he said, and then he gained momentum and gained this power. And so, this is what we see. We see people kind of just like throw bullshit at the wall to see if it sticks. And we don't know how much they believe it or not, but at the same time, you'll get people kind of getting behind it, and all of a sudden you have this weird organic movement out of this thing that's incredibly false.
Yeah, and like really amorphous too. Like I love the fact, just like soap opera characters, I feel like
yes.
they can be evil and then they're good and then they're evil again and then they're good. Like sort of like there's an inconsistency to the character,
right?
And
always.
I don't want to be too theoretical here, but it's making me think about like Hollywood and sort of like how old fashioned they are, and feeling like there has to be a consistent character to this celebrity.
Right.
You talk about like the idea of kayfabe. And the idea of like keeping up a certain sort of a sort of illusion, and not breaking that. I feel like Will Smith standing up and like slapping Chris Rock was like, first of all, people had mentioned professional wrestling. They said this is the world of professional wrestling coming into the hallowed grounds of the Academy Awards.
It's always been there.
But that's true. But it's also, it's all celebrity. But there's also, I feel like Will Smith, I don't know if you would agree with this, sort of like broke the kayfabe of his career. Like he's like, his image is of this good guy that wouldn't do something like that, and that's why there's a crisis for them.
Always.
Because they're too stuck in an old mode of not being fluid like the character that Trump is or Vince McMahon, etc.
Right. No, I think
a thesis I'm throwing out.
Exactly. I mean, the thesis is always everything is professional wrestling. But you remember when it happened, like I didn't watch it live, but I was on the internet, because I'm always on the internet. And the initial reaction was like, this isn't real. Right. We think we think everything is staged. We think everything must be because of everything's professional wrestling. And it's funny to me because I as somebody who's known as a professional wrestling guy amongst like friends or even in academia, I had like an older like colleague who wouldn't give me the time of day. After Trump got elected, was like, I've been thinking a lot about how like you like professional wrestling, and I came up with this idea like Trump is doing professional wrestling. And I was like, yeah, no shit. Like, like
you're like, wow, what a revelation.
The man's in the WWE Hall of Fame. The first couple WrestleManias were in Trump. Like you watch like Hulk Hogan walk out there and everyone's in Trump Plaza gear. Like it's always been there. And so like,
that's what I meant by liberal elite, is I was really talking about like academia.
You sure? I know. I mean? Yes, I 100% get it.
Because bringing, I don't think it's a thing anymore. I hope it's not. But like bringing in, I was in graduate school in 2004, and I'm thinking that like if I had brought in, and I was in a history department, which is a little more conservative, I think, than in their range of topics and stuff, and than like maybe English or American studies. And I discovered that I had to find out how timid history can be as a discipline. But yeah, I'm imagining if I had brought wrestling and said I'm going to do the history of wrestling, there would have been a lot of older professors who would have been like, "What are you doing? Like what this belongs somewhere else, or it might not be appropriate." Yeah.
It is. I think that's exactly it too. And kind of coming across those things, and it's been interesting to kind of see. And again, I had a little bit more mainstream. I have a colleague at UA who's in the religious studies, and he's super into professional wrestling, kind of looking into the stuff and kind of the theory of the occult and how we use the Undertaker and like all these other elements.
I gotta get this person on the show. We'll exchange email addresses.
Absolutely.
That sounds great. I love this, Brian. This is why I wanted to speak with you. Is because we've talked about wrestling a couple times on the show. Obviously, it's a topic that everyone's kind of into right now because it's sort of like wrestling, Trump, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But your book, and I really want to impress this upon people. Your book, it takes it on from really interesting angles, and angles that I think are worth considering within that whole milieu, that I thought they made it very personal to me. Like it made thinking about wrestling, because I'm not a huge wrestling fan. It's been present in my life, and I've watched it a ton, but I don't know all the names. I'm not like a super fan, but at the same time, I feel like, you're talking about Jackass, you're talking about even like, you remember, I mean, even when Eminem, like here's one that combine everything we've talked about in this episode, because like Eminem like had songs where he was making fun of NSYNC and and being like I'm on Team Limp Bizkit, but he was also like making fun of and roasting like Insane Clown Posse, who were wrestlers and like doing wrestling at their show, and like
Juggalo Wrestling, Vampiro, they're on WCW. It is, and I think like even tapping into that stuff, and even like it's all kind of ties into, and we can try to figure out it's like professional, but like when we talk about battle raps too, we talk about 8 Mile, like they're promo battles, right? We
There
have
you
these
go.
ideas
Yeah.
of promo battles or battle, and we have, there's a great John Cena was a rapper, right? Like that was his first like character when he'd come out and he'd try to like he'd do bar, and he has his album's not bad. And so
That's
he comes out and
great.
do that. We currently have a group, and to go completely full circle, right? We have a group in AEW called the Acclaimed who are great, and they come out and they every time they go out they do like it's essentially like an 8 bar diss rap of the person they're about to wrestle. And then to go completely full circle, they're presented as these very masculine guys coming in like tough guys. One of them is one of the only openly gay mainstream wrestlers, is one of the wrestlers out there.
Love it.
Kind,
Yeah.
kind of still performing this very masculine kind of role, but not really like. And so I love
See,
it. They're beloved. They're so great.
it's so funny to think that the prejudice among this straw man of liberal elite academics that we're creating in our minds, but it really exists.
Yes, it does.
It's funny to think of that resistance because a lot of the resistance would be like, well, this is unsophisticated and stupid kind of thing, and you're kind of like, well, to me, what you're describing is an audience that's very savvy. Like honestly,
Yeah.
one of the most like postmodern audiences
very,
you could
very much so.
like in terms of engaging in a story that has like they everyone understands that there's like multiple layers happening at once, it seems like.
And multimodal. I mean, I think that's also part of it too, and I think that's why even just like comp ret scholars are into it, right? Because it's like we're creating, it's like, oh, there's the television show, but then there's the YouTube channel, but then there's this personal Twitter account, but then there's also like actual press releases, and there's all the, and then you run into the person and are they in character? Are they not in character? What are the moments that we kind of blur these lines where I'm watching wrestling documentaries, but the characters are sometimes in character and sometimes they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, or they allude to the fact like they talk about the backstage stuff, but at the same time, they're like, well, I knew I wanted to win. And you're like, no, it was scripted, right? Like, it's not fake, it's predetermined, right? That's the joke that they say.
Right.
But they still referencing, well, I knew I wanted to go out there and win the title. And you're like, yeah, but you were supposed to. But like so talk about all this real stuff that was happening, but also that. And so I think like, but I think it's like anything else where if you're passionate about something, there's always somebody who kind of has a cursory knowledge of it. And they're always going to kind of like talk to you about, I love college football too. And so people come in and talk about like a very cursory thing that like, here's a theory about college football. Here's like, here's a theory about professional wrestling. Did you know that Trump's doing professional wrestling? Not giving professional wrestling fans the credit that they have.
Right.
Like
it's just like underestimating Trump's popularity,
yes.
and saying like, oh, no one's actually into this shit. And it's like,
yeah.
Why are you? There's a weird kind of like denial of reality there.
Yes. And I think that's definitely part of it, is not acknowledging. And I think we see that with any type of like fandom, right? Like if I try to like, I'm not a huge comic book person, but if I try to like, oh, here's my comic book. I saw this comic book thing and here's my theory. And meanwhile, my friends who are comic friends are like, yeah, no shit, dude. Like,
right.
Of course I've thought about, like, you're insulting me by thinking I didn't think about this, but of course I've thought about this. And I think like, maybe because of class, that's what professional wrestling is too, because people are like, oh, like, did you know that X, Y, and Z? And you're like, yeah, no, I'm a fan. I've thought about these things.
Right.
I've quote unquote, studied these things. Just because they're considered lowbrow and what you study is quote unquote highbrow, doesn't mean that I haven't put the work in or I haven't recognized these things.
Right. Yeah. I think it's part of what is so great about the wrestling coming into academia is sort of like we need to like I guess it's a wrestling metaphor, but we need to like slap these people around. Like the idea of that level of sort of discourse being already present among the fandom is really, I think, a really important one. In other words, it's not like academics coming in and being like, I am going to study this anthropologically and discover what's actually going on here. When we're saying like, no, that like this sort of like, I think of wrestling fans as very like at the cutting edge of what's happening in politics and culture, etc. because of that engagement. I mean, just like hip hop, you're saying.
Yeah.
We call it masculinity, and I think it might be like a wider thing than that. Like it's something to do with capitalism, this need to like boast, this need to like sort of make a character out of yourself, the need to like play that character. It's even more
to get, quote unquote, get yourself over, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
like, you know,
and it's always been there. You can see them in like the noir movie salesman, you know, that's trying to like go out there and make it in the world. At the same time, it's like the internet has only expanded that notion that everybody
100%.
has to like brand themselves. And wrestling has been there to like, I don't know, sort of like, it's almost like prophetic in the way that it's laid out, sort of what the world was going to be like.
I mean, I think like the joke is that we say that it was after the Attitude Era was what they called the reality era. Like, you know, that's what they called it, because it was, I mean, it ties into reality television. It ties into using the internet, and it ties into, you know, like getting your phone out. And, you know, they were like, the joke was WWE was one of the first people to invest in like a proto, almost like a proto Vine, a proto TikTok thing, where it was like you record, it was called Tout. And I think it just like died out immediately. But they were one of the first people to recognize, oh, like, yeah, we're going to like use this video platform.
Tout.
To
I love it.
Yeah, I know. I need to look up what happened to Tout.
It's totally accidental that didn't take off, because it could have taken. We could have been having this interview on Tout now.
On Tout, right. Yeah, exactly. That the joke that they say about like, yeah, Skype had a 28-3 lead, right? So like, you know, and blew it and Zoom took over. But like, yeah, I think like they'd always been aware of that kind of a connection and that blurriness. And that's what we like, especially the line of professional wrestlers always need to get themselves over. They need to get the win over the fans. And like, that's what we do on the internet. Like, we're always trying to like, we're waiting for that one promo. We're waiting for that one match to get our fans to buy in, right? I'm waiting for that one fire tweet that's going to get me all of my followers, right? Like, I'm waiting on that one, you know, as you do the podcast, you're waiting on the one podcast episode to like, you know, everyone to listen to. And now it's
this one, Brian. This is going to be
the
one.
This is the one. We got this. Absolutely. Powers combined, right? Like it all comes back.
God, that's such a mind fuck. And like, isn't it? I mean, it's really, you do begin to really be that guy who's like, wow, wrestling really got it. Wrestling really sort of like engaged intentionally or not in a template that seems like it's everywhere.
In the same way they didn't get so many other things. But, you know, I think the problem is they again, we see what sticks, right? Like, you know, there's so many things they failed on, and they've failed. Right.
That's the other end of it. We could do another show about like the dark corporate side of wrestling. And I mean, it's in your book, honestly, a lot about like, I don't know, the toll on the body, but also like how exploitative the industry is itself when you talk about capitalism. Hugely. And they're so much going
independent. They're independent contractors, so they don't have to give them healthcare. Like,
they're adjuncts.
Yeah, they're all adjuncts, and we can talk about the adjuncting of the world too. Like, you know, it all kind of like, but it all. It's just, we try to pretend that wrestling is not of the world, but wrestling is of the world, right? It's another thing, right? And I think we do that with any type of fandom, right? Where we say, oh, it's this own separate thing. It's like, yeah, well, every type of fandom taps into these things, and to pretend that doesn't, like, is silly, right? But for whatever reason, there are certain things we produce as frivolous. Like I talk about, again, I love sports and I love college sports, and people say like, oh, you know, yeah, that's different, or like, this is its own separate thing. I'm like, no, this is still part of everything, right? Like, we're still talking about capitalism. We're still talking about
labor,
like, you know, labor and exploitive labor. And people are like, oh, do you know that these people are like, and again, talking to me about like, oh, do you know these student athletes are being exploited with their labor? I'm like, yeah, no shit. Like, they've been talking about this for a long time.
It's weird to think that people aren't talking about that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, like sports fans, the idea that sports fans wouldn't be talking about the labor issues. Have you followed baseball strikes? Have you follow this shit? The fans, it's not like when a strike happens, the fans quit caring or thinking about these things. They're actually deeply engaged in it, and it's actually an opportunity for the left, honestly, to educate people through sports about like labor and all these important issues.
That's what I try to do on the internet all the time. I try to slide in, and I'm like, hey, you know, like, why are you siding with management? Like, you know, you know, why don't you, you know, you love this baseball player. Why you should listen to what he's saying, right? You love this guy because he's good at, you know, X, Y, and Z. But, you know, you should
the left actually weirdly invested in a moment like with LeBron for a while, right? They're like LeBron James. That's interesting to me. There's wrestling too, you know. Here's this big, amazing looking and amazingly talented basketball star. Like, this is a guy who could like lead the people, right? You know, in some way. It's funny we invest so much hope in people like that, and their bodies and skill, athletic skill, have something to do with how we trust them.
I mean, that's the joke about like, The Rock, right? Everyone's like The Rock for president, like, and to the point where I think his television show, I've only watched a couple of things, is the joke is that he's being interviewed as like the president, right? Young Rock. The conceit is him like reminiscing on his life, as from a perspective of a presidential candidate, because it's been so much of a joke, right? But yeah, I mean, that's what we have. Jesse Ventura, right? Like, so we have these folks who are kind of built into these professional wrestling mindsets, kind of finding their way into these elements. And so, yeah, I think, it's obviously difficult. We're looking for that savior, which doesn't always happen, right? Like we build people up to be, that's a longer conversation about, like, especially on the left, we build people up to be, the end all be all. Then they do one slight, they say the wrong thing, or they don't use,
like, where's that blurriness? Let's have that blurriness of character. I mean, I say this all the time, and it's really maybe controversial because I live in California, and Gavin Newsom is such a fucking snake of a character.
Yeah,
but he has that wrestling kind of thing going on.
He does, man.
This, and I'm like, actually, I think that this guy could be a powerful politician. In part because he's like so. Like, you can't really look at him. He's a blur, like he's just sort of like this guy that's like, and he's ridiculous in that campy way with his hair.
He is. Yeah. And I think, like, even like, he posts the picture of like banned books, right? And the Twitter thing is, it was so bad and so staged.
And like brilliant.
And he's a brilliant troll, and everyone dunked on him. And I was like, this guy knows what he's doing. This guy gets it.
He knows, and he's trolling the right.
And I hate it, but I also like, okay,
I hate it, but I have to respect it.
Yeah, exactly. I know that's kind of how it works. But yeah, no, it all those things. And again, as we present ourselves, and it all kind of, again, getting ourselves over. It's like we always talk about not amplifying voices, screenshot instead of retweet, like all these types of things. And it's because we don't want to accidentally get the wrong person over, right? Like, I think that's kind of how it is.
God,
and,
that's amazing.
And people are going to do what people are going to do with something. And I think, like, that's something that wrestling has fought, but also learned, right? Like, they're like, where we try to push, this is the champion they want to push. If the people don't want it, if the people are booing the guy at the building, you got to find a different way. You got to find a different element.
I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it's almost like wrestling is like politics. Have you ever noticed that?
What? No, really? Amazing. Unbelievable. I should look into that. Maybe.
Check it out. There's actually a book you might want to check out. It's by Brian Oliu. It's the name of the book is Body Drop: Notes on Fandom and Pain in Professional Wrestling. I think people who listen to Nostalgia Trap will be very interested to check it out. And I wanted to thank you, Brian, for tossing around the wrestling ball with me. That was really, really fun.
Yeah, I'm always happy to do it, and thank you so much for having me. And don't be a mark, right? Like, that's your lesson.
Yeah.
My final words: don't fall into the trap. Don't be a mark.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to wrap us up for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank Brian Oliu. Really, really intense and fun conversation. I enjoyed that, and I hope you did as well. We've got a lot more fun stuff on our Patreon page. If you want to go check that out and subscribe, we appreciate it. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.